Hello, hello. This is Mariangela Capello, your Mac, and we are here with Elizabeth Coffey, Liz, and this is your podcast, Becoming CEO. We are very happy to start today this podcast with one very special guest, George Koperna. And I have known George for several years. He's the CEO of Advanced Resource International, that we're going to call ARI. We invited him because he has very particular insights on that pathway that is becoming CEO, because he is one of those persons that will probably role model many of the things that you will find interesting. He has become CEO recently, and we are delighted to have him joining our podcast.
Thank you very much for the very kind words. Very rich career means I have no hair anymore and I'm very old. And so, about me, I'm a West Coast US kid, born and raised, and just before high school moved to the East Coast. So, I was bi-coastal for a time. I decided very early on that I wanted to be a petroleum engineer in high school. And I went to school at West Virginia University, where I received both my bachelor's and master's degree in petroleum and natural gas engineering. I did 2 years of post grad work at the Department of Energy in Morgantown, West Virginia. And that eventually leveraged me to landing in the fall of 1996 at Advanced Resources International, can't even say tongue tied this morning, where I started as an engineer in September of 1996, and I'm still here today.
Great. And I think that summarizes just what is the formal part of your career. But certainly, we want to get to know you more. What are the motives that you find are those driving people to become CEO? What would you say is the main driver of people when they are at that stage before becoming CEO?
It's a really interesting question, and I don't know what the right answer is. I can tell you what my answer is, and I think it's probably different for everyone. As I said, I've been at this firm for almost 30 years. So obviously, as you said, I love working here. I love the work we do. It's mostly unconventional oil and gas, CO2 applications, which includes both enhanced recovery and CCS, as well as a few other minor things. But it's really always been about the work, and then along with the work comes the people. And so they don't tell you this when you're in engineering school, and maybe you ladies, when you do your work, you actually inform people more, but that, hey, as you get really good at what you do, we're going to challenge you by moving you up and giving you things that you're maybe not so good at initially to do. And it's a learning experience. And for those that like me that like to continue to learn, it's a different kind of learning because interpersonal dynamics is very different than reservoir engineering. And for me, the motivation is always we want to do the fun work. Eventually, the natural progression is I was good at being a general engineer, then I was good at being a project manager, then I was good at being a VP. What's the next step? And for a small energy consultancy like ours, where we have 50 plus people, that probably is very different than, let's say, a larger, more integrated oil and gas company. So the motivation's probably a little bit different, but it's about progressing the company. It's about stepping into getting ready for the 2030s, right? And how we do that.
I'd love to pick up, George, on something that you've alluded to and make it a bit explicit, because I've done a lot of work, as I was mentioning to you before we pressed record, in the energy sector. And I'm very conscious that in engineering companies generally, there's a big focus on technical training. And there's a push for all of those kind of engineering roles that you're talking about to learn about this aspect and that aspect. And usually the biggest companies are really good at anticipating what people are going to need next and then kind of offering that to them and paying for it. And so it's an incredible journey actually for people in the field as engineers to be learning. It's just a kind of like a constant. But the focus is on the tech side, is on the engineering capability. And the managerial skills and the leadership skills that you were talking about in a kind of generalized way about like the behavioral element of it, about how people engage with each other, are often forgotten in many companies, are not on offer, or as an industry tend to come slower online. And some places never offer them. So it becomes what you kind of described, which I'm sure you've seen in many organizations that you work with, which is basically you kind of fly by the seat of your pants. And if you've got good managerial natural skills or good leadership skills naturally, well, God bless you, and the team members are delighted. And if you don't, sort of tough luck for everybody. So it's kind of interesting to me because I know you've been in one organization for almost 30 years, and I'm going to want to ask more questions about that later. But you work as a consulting business with lots of other energy firms. And so I'm interested in kind of like the George bird's eye view of the organizations that you've witnessed and where they are in this kind of mix of technical, managerial, and leadership development.
I think that's a really interesting question. It's been something we've been struggling with. I've been on the job, as it were, for almost a year now. And we have principals that have come from large integrated oil companies to the firm that have had exposure to some of these soft skill trainings that a Shell or an Oxy or an ExxonMobil sending 30 people to is easily done. Whereas that's a large proportion of that's 60% of our firm. And so we can't do that on a day-to-day basis when our product isn't hydrocarbons, it's knowledge and time. And I think we really struggle with finding open courses to engage our talent in those skill sets. And when we find them, we try to prioritize who to send. And an example of that is I think at the beginning of this year, sent one of our vice presidents to a negotiations class, which isn't typically done, but we wanted to see what the value proposition was. Let's dip our toe into it because of something that was offered and we knew, but ultimately it was a good decision. It was a valuable thing, but we're not negotiating the same kinds of contracts that E&P companies do. It's very much time basis rather than something else. And I think how we do that and how we engage with that has really been a day-to-day issue, and a little bit of a sigh there because I wish I had a better answer, but there's not a lot of courses out there like that. I think there's lots of coaching, but you don't see a lot of very specific soft skill training courses. And I know SPE tried to do some of this through their management technical section. And, I want to call that out because I don't know where that went, but it kind of got buried and pushed to the side, I worry. But they were trying to do a little bit of that. And what we're finding now is that some of that best training is mentoring, internal mentoring with our company, people that might have had that training on that skill. I know I've had mentoring in my new role from one of our board members who's been the CEO of a couple different companies. And so he's always, if I have questions, he has an open door policy for me. And that's a very different dynamic than more organized, more programmatic training.
Well, if I may pick up that, comment about SPE, let me inform that the management element of, what was the Business Leadership and Management Committee became a technical section that started as management technical section, and I chaired it last year. and we won the World Presidential Award for Best Technical Section. What we did is to push the idea that management is very technical skill as it relates within SPE. And George, we have a taxonomy. There is several skills like risk, analysis, asset integrity, benchmarking, to name a few. But there are others, as you very well say. And yes, those many times fall through the cracks, and it's very difficult to train somebody to gain those. And I am particularly interested in deep dive into your own story. And we are fascinated by that change. 30 years in the company and now becoming CEO 1 year ago. Tell us about, was that really a big change? Are there one, two, three elements? What would you highlight that, really surprise you about that change of becoming CEO?
At the very high level, let's say 100,000 foot level or 100,000 meter level if you're overseas, it's much more of a dynamic of relating to other people. I deal with more personnel issues than any technical things that I could possibly. I still have that in my hip pocket that I can pull out my technical card when I want to, but it isn't very often anymore. It's more, hey, I have this challenge. We need to resolve this challenge. And it's almost like you can call me the great arbitrator of ARI. I have to engage both sides and come to that medium conclusion here that works for both parties. And you know, a little bit about my firm, we're kind of set up like a law firm. So we have these autonomous business units. So I'm, kind of like, to use a sports analogy, the commissioner of ARI in some ways. And so I report back to the board, which are the partners and the shareholders in the firm, which are also running these autonomous business units. And so there's a lot of finding the middle ground. There's a lot of not being very comfortable sometimes in uncomfortable situations, but that's natural. Not everything's going to be very, very smooth. And so, a very long answer to a very short question. I'm sorry, but it's dealing with people. It's less about the technical minutia and more about dealing with personalities.
Can I just sort of jump in for 1 second? Because I'm conscious that I'm going to probably shock you here, George, by telling you that I teach about 55 different leadership courses. And so you can kind of get a sense of what Maria was talking about before, that, there's lots of technical elements to this business. And some of them are management courses, but I would say more than half of them are leadership courses. And in addition, I've done mentoring. And in addition, of course, I do CEO coaching and successor coaching every day. And each one of those brings a different angle on these skills, if you will, and kind of takes it. And when you talked before about mentoring, one of the things that mentoring is great at is passing on the knowledge of the more experienced person to you. But the problem is that CEOship, leadership, is a very personal activity that requires authenticity. So when you, for example, start to talk about a CEO role being as an arbiter between these different factions, that's one way of leading. And it's a way that obviously feels comfortable for you. But let's say you had a leader who was more like the leader of the United States as your mentor. You'd be getting a very different kind of advice about what's the right way, and I'm putting that in quotation marks, the right way to lead if you were being mentored by that individual. So there's something very interesting about mentoring in the sense that I can tell you how I would do it and what I've seen work. But at some level, George has to say, that part of it works for me, but this part of it feels alien or is wrong for the situation or is not going to work with that colleague or whatever, and have to kind of almost pick and choose. You can't just take it as this is the solution, like you could in an engineering situation.
I wholly agree. And that's only, a fragment of the spectrum, I think is the right way to look at it. And And certainly if I was at a much larger organization, thousands of people, I wouldn't be as accessible as I am in a 55 person organization. I see it as part of my job to be accessible to everyone across the chain here at the firm. And so down to the administration side, to the entry level engineers, geoscientists, and whatnot here, I try to have time in each office on a quarterly basis. We have 3 different field offices, including the main office here in DC. So I try to make a point to be there just so they see that I'm there. If they have a concern, they can engage with me. But I think if I were at a much larger, that wouldn't happen. You couldn't do that. And I think I'd have more of a authoritarian bent. That's too strong of a word, but because of the nature of the firm that I'm currently with, it's much more a give and take with partners.
I was very fascinated by your choice of word about being an arbitrator, because I have seen other descriptors for CEO, and many end with OR, like dictator, for example, and instead of arbitrator. But in a way, that reminds me, and I wanted to ask you about that. Now that you are CEO, you will probably have seen that it's very solitary kind of role, in the sense that Lisa and I have been coaching people in many regions of the world with different cultures, but this is a common platform. People at the helm are, finding, and that is one of the surprises that they tell us. They find themselves sometimes, yes, surrounded by many people, surrounded by many problems and things to solve, and things to advance. But that chair is very a solitary position. Do you find that is your case as well? Was that a surprise for you?
I haven't necessarily found that impact on myself yet. I'm very collaborative by nature, and I think that that's been helpful in this process. So I'm I'm always seeking advice, particularly with my peers here at the firm. I think there are many here that have more experience than I do in terms of being a consultant and running the firm. Our president is still and founder is still working with us, and he's in his middle 80s, and so tremendous resources all, and I think I'd be foolish not to listen.
It's a wonderful thing to hear, George, and I can tell you from working with leaders every day, it's not necessarily average to hear of a CEO who is a natural collaborator and humble enough to be asking other people for guidance and for input on things. It happens sometimes, in my view, with the best leaders, but one of the things I'm aware of is that collaboration and asking other people their view works in situations where you have time on your side. But if you think about, for example, military situations where people's lives can be lost or damaged if you don't make a split decision now, it's a kind of different sort of leadership that actually thrives in that kind of a situation. And I wonder, you're obviously not working in the military. Have you had moments as a CEO in your first short year where you felt like you wish that you had a slightly different style? And if so, what style would that be?
Really interesting question. And while I'm not in the military, my father was in the Marine Corps and my son was in the Marine Corps. And so I get where you're coming from, and I understand it. And thank goodness I don't have life or death decisions at my fingertips. I'm grateful for that. But I just so there's been times when I wish I could be firmer. I don't believe ultimately, though, that comes in a very heated moment quite often. And sometimes perspective is your greatest friend. And I think I'm grateful that maybe I wasn't as firm as I wished I would have been in the time because again, I feel it's you're getting a perspective from a 55 person consultancy where I'm basically engaged by partners who are also on the board and I'm between the same people on either side. And so it's a little bit different and I think they're my partners too in a lot of ways. And so, I think that perspective has helped. Uh, the count to 10 strategy, go to the conference room, count to 10 and come back often helps. And so, no, there have been times, but quite often it's the perspective has led to that it probably wasn't the right time to be more authoritarian or any other form. But I'm sure that time will come, and I think it'll be challenging. It really will because it's not my nature to be that way, but I know it's part of the job, and there will be times that I'll have to do that.
As Maria knows, I am particularly fascinated in the becoming CEO kind of headline with the dynamics that happen when there's an incumbent CEO who, for whatever reason, is going to be leaving. A successor is chosen internally who starts to get some development, usually with me. Sometimes there's more than one person being coached at the same time, usually not by the same person. So two different coaches for two different individuals. But what starts out as being a kind of comfortable situation, meaning the incumbent feels, oh, Joe Bloggs could never be as good as me. Once the coaching actually moves forward, after a relatively short period of time, that notion is being debunked by reality. And the incumbent starts getting nervous, anxious, suddenly rethinking, do I really want to leave? What am I going to do after this? And then often creates drama inside politics, inside the organization. And I've seen all sorts of Shakespeare level plays kind of work their way out in front of me. I'm interested in, as a consultant working at senior levels and looking out at the groups of people that you work with, if you've seen examples where that kind of successor moving up into a CEO role was bumpy, and if so, how? And if you've seen them smooth, and if so, why?
It's an interesting question. Let's start with the smooth, and I think there's been a lot of transitions that have been smooth, and I think it's always an outwardly perception, and this is I think I can put on my I have an opinion hat, and I think that's generally what you're asking. So the smooth ones, I think they tend to be external incoming people, and that's because there isn't a history, there isn't the Mac passed me over and now she's CEO and I have those same skills. And you don't develop that. I tend to see when they come from an external place. Now there's still hurt feelings and those people may leave that organization. But I think that has generally been a little bit smoother than the I'm going to promote Mac over you, George, because I think she'll be better at it because that's more hurtful in a lot of ways, and I think that causes a lot more hard feelings to the senior leadership. And now I don't know whether I fit in the I was smooth or I'm a bumpy because I was promoted up, but I think that arbitrator viewpoint, I think, is tried to help, when you're again reporting to partners on one side and the board who are those same partners in a lot of ways on the other side, you kind of I'm the meat in the sandwich, more or less.
In this story, George, you knew that you were groomed to become CEO at a certain point, and were you the main candidate always to become CEO of your company?
I don't know that grooming is the right word. I think what we saw was, some aging partners and a need to step into the 2030s. And, I think part of it is succession planning. There was some of that at play. And I think, I can joke that I was just happened to be at the right time in the right place and the right age and the right experience. But I'm fortunate that they saw something in me that maybe I didn't even see in myself as a leadership quality for the firm to take us to the next 20 years.
That is very interesting, and that is something that many times happen, but not all the times, because these kind of ranks fights in larger corporation happens earlier. And when I do coaching, is something very interesting as well. In the mid-level ranks, let's say manager, director, or deputy CEOs, I have noticed that one of the most useful advices or perspectives that I can inject in those conversations with the people I coach is, especially at manager and director level, have you chosen the potential 2 or 3 candidates that may substitute you? And that would be one of the first tasks, because in order to keep progressing in the corporation or in the organization you are in, you need to understand that you will be replaced. And to do that, you have to identify who would that people be, and then start, helping them grow into the role. And I am now delighted to see that you are so open as to share that you didn't see in yourself the qualities others were looking at. And that is very interesting. That takes me to the point to ask about ambition. Generally, the CEO path is full of ambition and driving and, energy, I would say, to drive not you or your career, but the company. And that is the fusion I was talking about at the beginning. When you become the company becomes you. Do you have any comments about that?
I do. I think that's exactly right on. Let me talk about it in terms of career progression. And so when you start at the firm and you're an entry level engineer, and I'm young and I have a full head of hair and all these other things, and my passion is reservoir engineering and numerical modeling and all those other things, and then I get promoted, and then all of a sudden I'm starting to manage projects and I'm becoming more of an administrator, and you're getting these training that you don't really realize you're doing it. You still have the same passions and you still are able to do the hard engineering that you like, but all and then maybe 10% of it or 20% of it is now I'm budgeting projects. And pulling that all the way forward, it's now I feel like 10 or 20% is the hard engineering and the 80% is the administration. And you've gotten this complete flip over time that you didn't really expect or come. And it just kind of ambushes you eventually. And you're like, oh, I'm now pushing papers that I never had to push before because I have reporting responsibilities for this project or that project or this on behalf of the firm now. And so I think that flipping happens. It kind of ambushes you. I used that word before. I like that because you're not ready for it, but you're slowly getting that training. And I think the really smart people that were above me all the time saw how you behave with that 20% of administrative work and how you deal with relating to your staff. Because ultimately, what people don't tell you is the way you treat your roles as you progress through a firm, if it doesn't change, you're not going to be long at that company. And so if you're a micromanager, that's really great when you're an entry level engineer and you're really working problems and you can, grind on it and turn those cranks on your models. But I think to be where I am today and be like that, I think it could work, but I think it would erode relationships and work very hard against other people to be a micromanager. There's too much going on to do that. It would be exhausting. And ultimately you have to recognize that the team has to bring its qualities to support you.
Indeed, and I would say a CEO should not be micromanaging. In fact, a CEO should not be doing any of those kinds of tasks of the delivery, because you have a different job, right? Your job is actually in managing a wide range of stakeholders, navigating the kind of people issues in your firm, or the arbitration that you talked about as well. It's not the kind of doing of the work, if you will. I want to, George, come back to something that you said in passing, but I think is one of the most critical dynamics in the becoming CEO, smooth or bumpy, which is the incumbent CEO or senior most leaders. In this case, it sounds like you had more than one founder. Them aging as the kind of prompt to, we are going to have to look for somebody who can take a leadership role into the next 10 years plus, 10, 20 years. That is a reason for leaving, which makes a lot of sense to most people. Now, sometimes I've seen founders resist like mad. And in some very kind of, big firms that I work with, the founders are in their 80s and still working because they just can't let go. And they've had advice before, you have to get successors. They've tried to do that and they just can't get out of it, because for people who are running a big organization, and 55 people is a medium-sized organization officially, but it's a lot of responsibility. It's consuming, and it's your identity. So this idea of the incumbent wants to leave because maybe there are health issues, maybe they, have had enough, they're tired, they want to take a cruise around the world, they want to write a book, they want to go play some golf, I don't know what. But if you have people who do not feel like that, it creates a completely different dynamic. And again, I appreciate you have your own experience with this, but you also have an array of businesses where you've no doubt in the course of your 30 plus years of working have seen it work in one way or another. I'm keen to kind of understand what you have seen and what you took away from what you witnessed.
I think your comments are spot on in a lot of ways, that the drive and the love that a founder has for his firm is second to none in a lot of ways, at least from a work perspective. And I think from our firm's point of view, when you begin to look at someone who loves what they do and does what they love, I think looking at them and saying, hey, what's in we talked about succession planning, who's in your white envelope in your desk drawer, that if something unforbid would happen, God forbid would happen to you, and you got hit by a bus tomorrow, who's going to step in and pick up the reins, and are they prepared to do that? And so we looked really hard at those, with a founder who's still loves what he does and does what he loves, but all right, let's start carving off some of the less exciting parts, the interpersonal dynamics that maybe you don't relish anymore, those kinds of things. Let's carve off the not so fun stuff for the new CEO to deal with, and that you got to start somewhere, and that's fine. But I think where I've seen that work well has been with okay, I'm resolved to understand that they're not taking over the firm today necessarily. We can still be, hence, I come back to collaboration as much as I can, and arbitration. Arbitration is probably still too strong, but it's, if you're not going to collaborate with your peers and your partners, at least in the way this firm is set up, I think it's going to be a rocky road, because they are semi-autonomous business units. And so as long as they're supporting themselves, the firm doesn't have to put in its heavy hand to control the actions of what that business unit's doing. And I think where we've had challenges is when you don't really look at the future and future-proof yourself in some way, and you have a more sudden change. And so it can work. I think you're then forced to make a decision rather than have time to transition people. Certainly, a petroleum engineer learning all there is to know about cost accounting and all those fun things that they do down the hall in the back of office. I'm dealing far more with accounting equations than I am with Darcy's Law right now, and that's fine. That's my job, and so I like the slow and steady wins the race mantra in some ways. That let's have that succession plan. Let's start it. Let's start looking at how do we modernize our KPIs? How do we step forward? How do we look at these things a little bit differently than we have been looking at it the last 50 plus years? Because we are now approaching 2030.
George, you don't know how much I appreciate this conversation. So candid, so open. And I want to now ask you about something that is a passion for me, and that is the multiculturalism. I am looking at, the page of your company and the website, and it is amazing the number of clients that you have there all over the world. And also in the energy sector, there are a variety of profiles with which are your clients: big companies, multinational companies, regional or national companies, service companies, and all kind of profiles, government, etc. More than 50 are here highlighted, but I know that there are probably more than that. How do you navigate that and grasp the essence of different cultures to be successful as a CEO within your company and for clients?
It's a really important question, at least for us. The I in ARI is international. We say we're international. So we do work abroad. We've done a lot of work over the years in the southern part of Africa, a lot of work in the India, and et cetera. And so how do we deal with that? I think you learn that culturally they're different in a lot of ways, and it's a lot of understanding. A lot of the international work I do with standards development has opened me up to cultures that I haven't, otherwise would never have had experience being in Southern California or Washington D.C. or West Virginia where I went to college. And I think another way that we really try to do this, and this is harder, is attract multicultural talent. And as a 55 plus or minus entity, that's a challenge that we take very seriously when we try to hire new folks. We're still trying to hire the most qualified and best folks, but we want to cast that net as wide as we can, and that's sometimes challenging. Going to some of the social media recruiting platforms it's like wading into murky water in some ways with talent, because you just don't know what you're going to get. You get a lot of potentially qualified people, but it's when you actually sit down with them, at first blush, you're able to move past them very quickly because of several other factors. And so what we want to do is really make sure we're always casting a wider net so we can attract the best young gentlemen, best young ladies, regardless of race, so they can join our firm and hopefully be part of our family.
Thank you. I think that is a very smart way of looking at the thing of multiculturalism. And I have another. It's a question, but maybe it's more try to be incisive in this journey of yours about becoming CEO. And we have talked a lot about challenges, about problems, about how you solve problems and issues. But tell me now about joys. I mean, what did you find was, you are delighted about? You are in your CEO role, and you discover something, several elements that you really like in that role. You want to share that with us?
I don't want to diminish that question because it is, and I think when I have perspective, I think I'll be able to look back. I kind of feel like, when I look back at my career, then I'll say, oh, I really like this, I really like that, and I think right now it's a job. I love what I do. I love the firm. I love the people, and so I don't know that I have this one instance where I said, boy, that was great. And I would never have been able to experience that if I was not the CEO. It's not how I'm wired in a lot of ways, Mac, you know that. And so I think what I'll be able to do, and when I do retire, if my wife ever gets her way, is to look back and go, gosh, that was really great. And what a great ride. But I think when you're in it, you're in it. And I want to look back, but I want to look back to inform the future, not relish the past. And so that's kind of where I'm coming at this from. But it is a really great question. And perhaps if I had been on the job for 5 or 6 years, might have a different answer to that question. So we'll have to come back in 5 years, Mac.
So George, I wanted to pick up on something that you've mentioned a couple of times early in the conversation, which is about this kind of concept, the idea that as a firm, you want to be looking forward to the next 10, 20 years, and that indeed the leadership transition to you coming into the CEO job was driven partially by that idea that there's going to be somebody in you who can help with that vision, but then actually help lead through and to achieving it. So, in the context of the energy sector, which is obviously going through a big transition now towards a more sustainable future, I noticed in reading about you before we came into the recording that you do certain things like carbon sequestration and storage. I'm kind of keen to understand, where is that future from what you guys are thinking, and how does it link to the energy transition?
I think that's a really smart question. And I know you know that already. I think when we're looking at it going forward, and I think I can be candid about this, we sell our time, right? It's brain power, but it's positioning those brains in a way that we're able to respond and adapt to a changing environment. Now, we have an administration here in the US that is pulling the reins back on the energy transition in a lot of ways. I'm a petroleum engineer. It's what I do. I model the flow of fluids in the Earth's surface, right? At its very basic level, that's what a petroleum engineer does. And so I think what we really want to be able to do is look forward. Where are we going? How big of a player do we see enhanced geothermal in the 2030s? Is hydrogen for real, or is it on more of a timeline like CCS was? I was doing CCS work in the late 90s. And so, is this going to be a slow burn? And how do we prepare our staff for that? Is it training? Is it hiring people that think about this and have that expertise already? And these are decisions that we have to make as a firm and then support them. And so, I think when we look at areas that are upcoming and coming to the forefront, we're regressing a little bit. Oil and gas is already in our toolkit. Great. We love to do oil and gas work. We also like to do CCS, and in the best of both worlds, we're using that CO2 to make more hydrocarbons. And then we're doing EOR, enhanced gas recovery. So how we look at that pie and partition it out, it's still a little up in the air, to be frank, Elizabeth. But we look at that every gosh, we trying to be more strategic about this every 4 to 6 months, and kind of say, what are the trends that you're seeing in case I miss something? And that's where the collaboration is really, really important, because I can't be everywhere. I can't talk to everyone, but others are talking to different people and engaging with different folks than I am. And getting that perspective read back in is helpful to how we look to 2030. So not only the KPIs, are we bringing in enough work, or, you know, how is that work being delegated out in the various business units? Are we making the proper profits that we need to make to sustain our business, et cetera, et cetera? And there's that aspect, but then there's also the vision part of it that we're really working very, very hard on.
Talking about vision, George, I like that your company is navigating, these storms and changes in focus. in energy. And that is a very difficult thing to do. And perhaps this is a good moment to gain your insights about energy justice. You do work and consulting in different parts of the world, and in different countries there are different development levels, different GDPs per capita and total per country, different emissions, different priorities. And I am referring specifically to those countries trying to, provide more prosperity to their population, and they still cannot, versus others here in the States where you see prosperity in the making. So, how do you have that change your vision about why I have now come to a point in sustainability in everything I do where I understand that it's only a handful of countries that really need to curtail emissions, and others instead, as we heard in the recent workshop we organized together, they need to carbonize some of their towns before decarbonizing them. And I was wondering if that kind of exposure to a global economic system has changed your way of offering technology and working in technology.
I think it's a really interesting and thoughtful question. And the way I like to think about it is this. And years and years ago, I saw a very lovely presentation by Dr. Scott Tinker at the Bureau of Economic Geology talking about energy poverty. And as someone who's working mostly domestic work at the time, you don't recognize that you see what you see on the news and that there is energy poverty out there, but there's also certain folks that say, don't make the mistakes that we made by becoming a very large GDP country and carbonizing. You need to decarbonize right away when they haven't even, as you said, carbonized. And so that growth is tied in a lot of ways to the energy portfolio that a given country has. And I think how they harvest that energy is really, really important. And in some cases, it's not their government that's making poor choices. It's something else. And those politics I can't control or get involved in. But I think as we think about how countries can progress their population into having lights at night, having all of these other things without being impugned in a way, it was very interesting to me. Long story short, and I think I always try to keep that in the back of my mind when we're having projects, and the justice part of it is came home to roost in a lot of ways with projects we have in California. And we have a project in California, it's a CCS project. And we had, as part of it, in the very early days of these carbon safe CO2 awards in the US, we had to do public outreach. And that's been rolled back a lot by the administration. But so we went and there were listening sessions with the local public. And they're like, why should we believe you when every other company that's come in has told us this, that they were going to do this, and then went and did what they wanted anyway? How do we know you're going to do what you're going to do? And as a result of that, I can't trust you. And so you have to hear that, and you have to pay for other people's mistakes sometimes. And so I think the long and short of it is it's a case by case. We don't want to do harm. We're there to benefit. That's what the energy is for. It's to benefit the population. And as long as we're doing that and doing it in a way that's sustainable isn't the right word, but in a way that's not harmful, but it still can be sustainable, if you will. What we do know, and the lowest cost energy has always won out, whether it's wood or coal or natural gas or oil. And so in certain countries that might be different. And so we have to understand what that is and get that power to the people.
Like when George comes into his reflective mood and insightful ways of sharing his views, because I really enjoy listening to his experience in these matters, especially because I am very embedded in the energy sector. George, at this point, we are going towards the end of our podcast. Before passing over to Liz, I want to ask you about if you are thinking of giving us some advice for becoming CEO. I mean, what would you say is your recommendations for those professionals who are now already in a vice president role or an executive director role, and they are struggling with not only the politics but the actual skills that are needed for that?
I think what has served me well, and I'll start with this, is listen. A lot of times you want to say something, but let's listen, especially if you don't agree with what the other person is saying, because they may have a point you haven't considered. And I think surrounding yourself with people that you can bounce things off of is the second thing. And I'm a collaborator. That's worked for me. It may or may not be somebody's style, but I think there's an uncomfortable transition, even when it is comfortable, to new roles, and being able to weather that initial discomfort is really, really important. And how you listen to what's going on around you will kind of help with that.
Excellent. I think we have time for only one more question, and it may be related to the advice you just gave, and it may be completely different. We'll see. I'm keen to understand when you do leave, what will you be most proud of in terms of the legacy? What is the legacy you want to leave from your time as CEO in this organization?
What an awesome question. And so I think if I were to look back, obviously I'm serving at behest of the board of the firm. I would like to leave the firm better than it was when I took it over, which is no small feat. And so looking at that, personal accolades, I could do without. That's not what drives me. What drives me is where I want to go and where I want to take this firm and where I want to bring all my friends with me. And if I'm able to do that, then I've done my job.
Fantastic. I want to tell a story actually about a retirement, if I might. I was living in Germany many, many years ago, and one of my female friends was married to a guy who was on the board of one of the big companies called Hearst. I don't know if you've heard of this, but it's one of the giants, the kind of German giants. And they didn't have children. And so he retired. And on the first morning, when he was sitting down to breakfast, she put in front of him a list of like 10 different activities, which were basically do-it-yourself kind of projects. And she put this in front of him while he was drinking his orange juice and having his coffee. And he, picked up the piece of paper and he kind of, scanned it and looked at it. And then he signed the bottom, approved.
Well, George, I think that we need to hear from you more often and learn from you. And we wish you all the best in your CEO journey that you are starting. It was very refreshing to have with us in the podcast somebody that is just stepping into the role, because that vision and that passion comes across very vividly from you. And I like the words that we listened from you today: collaborator, arbitrator. And I think those define very well what your style is. We appreciate your participation. I will now take the opportunity to say goodbye to our listeners and remind everyone that this is Becoming CEO, a podcast where we explore those intricate pathways and the conversations that we many times do not have the opportunity to hear about how is it to become CEO. This was hosted by Dr. Elizabeth Coffey, now sitting in Abu Dhabi in the UAE, Maria Angela Capello in Houston, Texas, and our guest of today, George Koperna, in Washington, D.C. Thank you very much, everyone. And with this, we wait to see you in our next episode.